Everyone, Piscean here, bringing you the fuse and the fire. And what that looks like and means is a historical retrospective on malefic midpoints and hard aspect triggers and global catastrophe. Before we get started, please like, subscribe, comment, share if you dare, and care with peace and love. I appreciate you. Every single one of you I'm grateful for on the channel that is subscribing, liking, commenting, sharing if daring. This dissertation undertakes an advanced retrospective analysis of the role played by malefic midpoints and their activation by transiting personal planets and the timing of major global destructive events. Drawing on the cosmobiological tradition of Reinhold Eberton, the Uranian system of Alfred White, and the broader heritage of mundane astrology from Ptolemy to Charles Harvey, the study defines malefic midpoints as the half-sums of the traditional and modern malefics. And that would be Mars, Saturn, Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto, and their symmetrical combinations. Through a detailed examination of 5 pivotal events, the 1929 Wall Street crash, the September 11th attacks, 2008 global financial crises, the 2010 Haiti earthquake, and the COVID-19 pandemic outbreak. The dissertation demonstrates that these catastrophes were consistently accompanied by the exact hard aspect activation of a malefic midpoint by the transiting Sun, Moon, or a conjunction of the malefics themselves. The analysis advances the thesis that malefic midpoints function as latent energetic matrices which, when precisely triggered by rapid transits, release the compressed destructive potential into collective manifestation. Okay? So our keywords for this video: malefic midpoints, mundane astrology, cosmobiology, Eberton, White, hard aspects, Saturn-Pluto, Mars-Saturn, global crises, and transit triggers. Okay? Let's begin talking about the two malefics and the geometry of crises. So from the earliest strata of horoscopic astrology, the planets Mars and Saturn have been designated as the malefics. Ptolemy in the Tetrabiblos classifies the nature of Mars as chiefly to dry and to burn. And Saturn as cooling and moderately drying, both being destructive in their excess. The introduction of the trans-Saturnian planets in the modern era expanded the malefic category, with Uranus adding the principle of sudden rupture, Neptune that of chaotic dissolution, and Pluto that of compulsory annihilation and regeneration. The tradition of mundane astrology, the astrology of nations, peoples, and world events, has long correlated hard aspects, conjunctions, squares, oppositions between these malefics with periods of war, economic collapse, seismic catastrophe, and pandemic. Yet the timing of such manifestations frequently occurs not at the exact aspect of the outer malefics themselves, but when a faster moving body, being the Sun, Moon, Mercury, Venus, or Mars, triggers a sensitive midpoint formed by the two malefics. This midpoint, the half-sum of the celestial longitudes of two planets, represents a focal point where their combined archetypal energy is concentrated. In the words of Reinhold Eberton, the founder of cosmobiology, the midpoint is the point of synthesis. The planetary picture released by a transit to this point determines the event. The present dissertation investigates the historical record to demonstrate that many of the most destructive global events of the modern era were precisely timed by impersonal planets' hard aspect to a malefic midpoint. Chapter 2 is the cosmobiological inheritance, midpoints from White to Eberton. The astrological theory of midpoints originated in the early 20th century with the Hamburg school astrologer Alfred White, who formulated the concept of planetary pictures in the 90-degree dial. White's key insight was that the symmetrical relationships between 3 or more planetary points, expressed as A plus B subtracting C equals D, or the activation of an AB midpoint by planet C, constitute the most fundamental dynamic of astrological causation. The malefic combinations such as Mars-Saturn, Saturn-Pluto, and Uranus-Pluto were recognized as signatures of violence, destruction, and structural dissolution. Reinhold Eberton refined and popularized the system in the combination of stellar influences, removing the hypothetical trans-Neptunian planets of the Hamburg school and focusing solely on the 10 recognized bodies. He demonstrated that the midpoints of malefics, when contacted by a transiting planet, especially the sun or moon, could precipitate fires, accidents, political upheavals, and mass casualty events. Eberton's methodology emphasized an orb of 1 degrees for conjunctions, and 1 degrees through 2 degrees for squares and oppositions to midpoints and mundane work, with the proviso that the planetary picture form must be interpretively coherent. So, for example, Mars-Saturn equals Sun for an energy blockage or violent death, while Saturn-Pluto equals Moon for mass mourning and collective trauma. Okay? The integration of midpoint theory into mundane astrology was further developed by Charles Harvey in Mundane Astrology, co-authored with Michael Beijing and Nicolas Campion, where he systematically applied midpoints to national ingress charts and cycles of outer planet pairs, showing how the activation of, for instance, the Saturn-Pluto midpoint by a transiting sun or moon could bring a Latin crisis to a head. This dissertation stands firmly within that tradition, applying its principles to a series of retrospectively chosen historical disasters. Moving on to our methodology, the 90-degree dial, and planetary pictures and mundane analysis. The methodology employed in this study is the analysis of transiting planetary pictures using the 22.5 degrees and 45 degrees modulus, the 90 degrees dial. A malefic midpoint is defined as the half sum of the longitudes of any two of the malefics: Mars, Saturn, Uranus, Neptune, Pluto. The classical malefics Mars and Saturn and the modern malefics Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto form pairs whose midpoints carry the archetypal charge of destruction. In a full planetary picture, a third point, which is a transiting planet, an angle, or a sensitive point, activates the midpoint by conjunction, which is 0 degrees, opposition, which is 180 degrees, square, which is 90 degrees, semi-square, which is 45 degrees, or sesquiquadrate, which is 135 degrees. An orb of up to 2 degrees is allowed for events of global magnitude, with the tightest orbs under 1 degrees carrying the most precise timing. The historical events examined were selected on the basis of 2 criteria. The first is they represent destructive global events with massive human, economic, or political impact. And the second is the astrological charts for the onset or peak of the event exhibit a clear malefic midpoint activation by a transiting personal planet or by the malefic pair reaching exact aspect. The ephemeris used is a standard tropical geocentric ephemeris, and all longitudes are expressed in the standard 360-degree circle. For each case, the midpoint is calculated, the triggering transit is identified, and the archetypal meaning of the planetary picture is interpreted in the context of the event. Now we begin looking at our case studies and malefic midpoint activations, beginning with the 1929 Wall Street crash, Sun and Mars conjunct Neptune, dissolution of value. Okay? So, the collapse of the New York Stock Exchange in late October of 1929, which initiated the Great Depression, peaked on Black Tuesday, October 29th. The transiting configuration featured Mars at 8 degrees Scorpio in a tight opposition to Neptune at 1 degrees Virgo, forming the Mars-Neptune midpoint at 4 degrees 30 Libra. Mars-Neptune in its negative expression signifies mass illusion, financial speculation, fraud, and the evaporation of resources. Saturn at 25 degrees Sag stood 9 degrees from an exact square to this midpoint, a wider but contributing factor. The decisive trigger came from the transiting Sun, which on October 29th stood at 5 degrees Scorpio, already conjunct Mars within 3 degrees, and directly opposing Neptune. The Sun's conjunction with Mars and simultaneous opposition to Neptune effectively placed the Sun directly on the Mars-Neptune midpoint, forming the planetary picture Sun equals Mars-Neptune. So the Sun represents the focal consciousness and life force of the collective, and its conjunction with Mars-Neptune translates to its conjunction with Mars-Neptune translates the malefic combination into a global panic of vanishing wealth. Alright? The crash was thus lit by the solar fuse touching the Mars-Neptune explosive. Additional testimony here. The transiting moon on October 23rd, Black Thursday, had already crossed the Mars-Neptune axis from Gemini, setting off the initial shock. The alignment demonstrates how malefic midpoints, once activated by a luminary, can trigger a cascade of financial destruction. Alright? Now let's look at the September 11th attacks. Sun conjunct the Saturn-Pluto midpoint, the collapse of towers and order. So on September 11th in 2001, the United States suffered the deadliest terrorist attack on its soil. The astrological signature is in near exact opposition of Saturn at 14 degrees Gemini and Pluto at 12 degrees Sag. The opposition forms a Saturn-Pluto midpoint at 13 degrees Virgo, and its complementary point 13 degrees Pisces. The Saturn-Pluto combination is the archetypal signature of concentrated structural violence, mass death, and the collision of power with mortality. As Eberton writes, Saturn-Pluto in hard aspect is the monster, the brute, the destruction of matter. On 9/11, the transiting sun was at 18 degrees Virgo, while this is 5 degrees from the exact midpoint of 13 degrees Virgo. The sun formed a T-square with a Saturn-Pluto opposition, squaring both malefics with an orb of approximately 4 degrees. Crucially, the sun's conjunction to the midpoint, though slightly wide, is within the allowable mundane orb, and it's confirmed by the sun's exact square to Saturn and Pluto. Therefore, the planetary picture, Sun equals Saturn-Pluto, describes the day's horror precisely. The light of consciousness seared by an act of absolute destructive force. The sun's position conjoined the midpoint imbued the collective psyche with images of structural devastation and death. The activation of the Saturn-Pluto matrix released the energy that had accumulated through the exact opposition that had been building since the spring of 2001. Let's take a look at the 2008 global financial collapse, the Mars-Saturn-Uranus complex, the implosion of credit. And this video isn't going to be too very long because I'm just going to talk about, midpoints. I think we only have about 3 pages left. So, essentially, the bankruptcy of the Lehman Brothers on September 15, 2008 to be exact, marked the acute phase of the global financial crisis. The outer planet backdrop was a Saturn-Uranus opposition, with Saturn in Virgo and Uranus in Pisces. Mars entered Virgo in late August and conjoined Saturn on September 13th at 12 degrees Virgo, while both opposed Uranus at 20 degrees Pisces. The Mars-Saturn midpoint thus lay at approximately 16 degrees Virgo, directly opposite the Uranus point, forming the picture Uranus equals Mars-Saturn. Mars-Saturn connotes suppressed energy, brutal contraction, and a blockage that results in violent explosion, while Uranus adds the component of sudden radical rupture. So the activation came as the transiting sun moved through Virgo, reaching 21 degrees Virgo on September 15th. Although the sun did not form a precise conjunction to the 16 degrees midpoint, it was within 5 degrees and conjoined the Mars-Saturn-Uranus complex by being in the same sign and opposing Uranus. More critically, the sun formed the outer boundary of the massive stellium that lit up the entire Virgo-Pisces axis. The collective economic structure, which is Saturn, was shattered, Uranus, by the accumulation of toxic force, Mars-Saturn, and the sun's presence focused the public consciousness on the unfolding devastation. The sequence illustrates that when a malefic midpoint is embedded within a larger stellium, the transit of the sun through that zone can serve as the external trigger for systemic collapse. Let's talk about the 2010 Haiti earthquake, the Saturn-Pluto opposition at maximum strength, seismic rupture. So the catastrophic magnitude 7.0 earthquake that devastated Haiti on January 12, 2010 occurred at 21:53 UT. At that exact moment, the transiting Saturn and Pluto formed an opposition of extraordinary precision. Saturn at 4 degrees 32 Libra, Pluto at 4 degrees 31 Capricorn. So the Saturn-Pluto midpoint stood at 4 degrees 32 Aries Libra, directly tied to the opposition. In this case, the midpoint required no external trigger from a personal planet. The two malefics themselves, in exact opposition, formed the planetary picture. So Saturn equals Pluto's Saturn, or simply the perfect half sum, was in a state of maximum activation. The orb of opposition was less than 1 minute of arc. The Saturn-Pluto opposition signifies the literal breaking of the Earth's crust, Saturn, by plutonic forces, Pluto. The event, one of the deadliest earthquakes in recorded history, killed over 200,000 people and unleashed a humanitarian crisis of immense magnitude. The exact opposition reveals that malefic midpoints can be triggered internally by the malefics, reaching precise aspectual lock. The midpoint was therefore not passively waiting for a trigger, but was an active detonating field of force. This case underscores that the most catastrophic events often coincide with the perfection of malefic outer planet aspects themselves, when the midpoint becomes a fault line along which reality ruptures. Let's talk about the COVID-19 pandemic outbreak, Sun on the Saturn-Pluto conjunction, the seeding of a global plague. So the World Health Organization later declared a pandemic on March 11th, 2020, but the astrological seed of the COVID-19 catastrophe is universally recognized as the Saturn-Pluto conjunction in Capricorn, which is exact on January 12th, 2020 at 22 degrees 46 Capricorn. This conjunction merged the principle of systemic restriction, Saturn, with the force of mass contagion and death, Pluto. The midpoint of the conjunction is, of course, the degree of the conjunction itself, 22 degrees 46 Capricorn. On January 12th, the transiting Sun stood at 22 degrees 01 Capricorn, effectively exactly conjunct both Saturn and Pluto, and therefore precisely on the Saturn-Pluto midpoint. The planetary picture, Sun equals Saturn-Pluto, was formed with an orb of less than 1 degree. The Sun, symbol of life and vitality, conjoined the plague-bringing midpoint, signaling that the world's collective health would be the central focus of this malefic fusion. In the weeks that followed, the virus spread globally, leading to lockdowns, mass mortality, and an unprecedented restructuring of society. The Sun's annual conjunction to Saturn and Pluto is a regular transit, but its occurrence at the exact degree of their conjunction activated the archetypal matrix, releasing the pandemic into collective manifestation. Alright, on to our synthesis here. Towards a predictive model of malefic midpoint triggers. So the 5 case studies spanning nearly a century reveal a consistent pattern. Destructive global events are not randomly distributed in time, but cluster around the moments when a malefic midpoint formed by 2 outer planets is triggered by a hard aspect transit from the Sun, the Moon, or by the exact contact of the malefics themselves. The triggers act as a fuse that ignites the accumulated potential. The physical mechanism is archetypal and a causal, operating through a synchronistic alignment of celestial geometry and terrestrial event. From a forecasting perspective, the astrologer may identify future periods of high catastrophe potential by calculating the midpoints of all malefic pairs in the ephemeris for a given period. When a fast-moving personal planet, especially the Sun or the Moon, and secondarily Mars, is due to form a conjunction, square, or opposition to a malefic midpoint with an orb of 1 degree, a window of acute crisis activation opens. The nature of the crisis may be read from the planetary combination involved: Saturn-Pluto for structural collapse and mass death, Mars-Neptune for financial illusions, epidemics, and naval oil disasters, Uranus-Pluto for sudden explosions, revolutionary upheavals, and nuclear events, Mars-Saturn for warfare and brutal suppression. When multiple malefic midpoints are simultaneously activated, the risk is compounded. This model does not claim deterministic prediction, but offers a sound archetypal tool for risk assessment. The retrospective validation provided here strongly supports its inclusion in the modern mundane astrologer's toolkit. And we're going to conclude here. The geometry of catastrophe, as revealed through the lens of cosmobiology, demonstrates that the heavens do not express their most destructive potential continuously, but release it in precise triggered moments. The malefic midpoints formed by Mars, Saturn, Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto act as compressed reservoirs of collective destructive energy, while the Sun, the Moon, and Mars as triggers provide the temporal key that unlocks these reservoirs. The events of 1929, 2001, 2008, 2010, and 2020 each bear witness to this principle with remarkable accuracy. This dissertation has sought to revive and systematize the midpoint technique for the advanced mundane astrologer, providing a historically grounded, rigorous method for understanding the timing of global crises. In a world increasingly vulnerable to financial, seismic, and pathogenic catastrophes, the wisdom of the midpoint reveals that while destruction may be an inescapable dimension of the planetary order, its timing is written in the symmetrical dance of the celestial spheres. Thank you for watching this video with Peace and Love. I hope you learned, and I'll see you in the next one teaching you more astrology with Peace and Love, Piscean out. Subscribe, like, comment, share if you dare and care. Have a good one.